Chicago, the 30th of October, 1893, Jackson Park, South Lakefront. The fair is over. The crowds have gone home, back to tenements, back to farms, back to the tent cities that have sprung up across the American Midwest during the worst economic depression the country has yet experienced. And now, quietly, with no congressional debate and no public referendum and no sustained press investigation, the order goes out. Begin the demolition. A city that 27.5 million people walked through in 6 months, more visitors than the entire recorded population of the United States at that moment, is to be taken apart. 200 buildings, most of them gone within 18 months of the fair's closing day. Almost no surviving structures, no major public outcry, no formal inquiry, no monument to what stood there. The silence around the demolition of the White City is, in its own way, as remarkable as the city itself. Something that large, that visited, that documented vanishing that completely, that fast, is not an accident of history. It is a decision. And decisions leave traces. To understand why the White City disappeared, you have to go back to 1890, to the men who designed it, the system it demonstrated, and the one idea at its center that could not be allowed to survive. 4 cities entered the competition to host the world's Columbian Exposition in 1890: New York, Washington, D.C., St. Louis, and Chicago. New York had the infrastructure, the capital, and the institutional relationships. Washington had the symbolic weight of the federal government. St. Louis had the geographic position. Chicago had none of these advantages. It had no suitable site. It had a notoriously corrupt city government. It had barely 24 months before the exposition's mandated opening date. By any conventional measure, Chicago should not have won. The congressional authorization for the exposition had passed in April 1890, and what that legislation described was a celebration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, a grand spectacle, a commercial showcase, a statement of American industrial maturity to a skeptical European world. The commission awarded the bid to Chicago. And then Daniel Burnham arrived at a swamp on the south shore of Jackson Park, stood in the mud with Frederick Law Olmsted beside him, and was handed an impossible mandate with an impossible timeline. Burnham was 43 years old. He was already one of the most ambitious architects in America, a man who once said and was later misquoted into legend that you should make no small plans. Olmsted was in his late 60s, the designer of Central Park, a man who understood land as a system rather than a surface. Together they looked at a mosquito-infested marshland and began to design something that had never existed in America before. The commission selected Chicago, and then the real construction began. Not just of buildings, of a model. What was built in Jackson Park between 1891 and 1893 is routinely described in history textbooks as a temporary exhibition. That description is technically accurate and fundamentally misleading. Every major building in the White City was connected to every other via a network of underground service tunnels, conduits for electrical cable, steam heat, water pressure, pneumatic communication systems, and waste removal. The electrical grid was centrally managed from a single generating station. Transit was integrated into the site plan from the first survey drawings. The waste and water systems were engineered as a single interconnected organism. This was not a collection of ornate pavilions arranged for aesthetic effect. It was a functioning city, designed from the ground up as a unified, coordinated system, the kind of system that no American city of that era actually possessed. And it ran on something that had never been demonstrated at this scale anywhere on Earth. The White City ran on Nikola Tesla's alternating current. 100,000 incandescent lamps lit the fairgrounds every evening, the largest single electrical installation in history to that point. The contract had gone to Westinghouse Electric, which had outbid Thomas Edison's company at roughly one-third of Edison's proposed price. Edison, whose direct current infrastructure had been the dominant electrical system in American cities since the early 1882s, refused to allow his patented light bulbs to be used on the exposition grounds. Westinghouse responded by manufacturing 250,000 new incandescent bulbs specifically for the fair. The War of Currents, the commercial and technical battle between alternating current and direct current that had consumed the American electrical industry for nearly a decade, was effectively decided in Jackson Park in the summer of time. 1893. Louis Sullivan, who designed the fair's transportation building and who was perhaps the only architect on the grounds who genuinely understood what was being built around him, watched the White City take shape and felt something close to dread. He called the neoclassical aesthetic that dominated the Court of Honor a damage to American architecture that would last half a century. He was being precise about the architectural consequences. He may not have fully understood how deep the damage would go. Because here is the first and most important thing. The official historical record of the 1893 exposition has never adequately explained. The White City was not erased because it was a failure. It was erased because it was a success. A specific, observable, undeniable, publicly witnessed success. It proved that a fully planned, publicly coordinated, aesthetically coherent, technologically integrated urban environment was not a utopian fantasy dreamed up by socialists or reformers or impractical idealists. It was buildable by American workers with American materials in 2 years. For 27.5 million visitors who arrived, walked through it, experienced it, and went home to cities that had none of it. That fact, that specific fact, was apparently too dangerous to leave standing. The world into which the White City opened was not stable. The Panic of 1893 began in May, the same month the fair opened its gates. 500 banks failed before the year was out. 15,000 businesses collapsed. Unemployment across the country climbed to somewhere between 17% and 19%, depending on whose measurement you trust. And the Census Bureau's own economic reports from that period suggest the real figure may have been higher in industrial cities. Outside the White City's gates, on the streets of Chicago and across the Midwest and the East, tent cities of the unemployed multiplied. Coxey's army, hundreds of out-of-work men marching on Washington to demand federal relief, assembled in the same weeks that fair attendance broke records. On the 12th of July, 1893, a 32-year-old historian from Wisconsin named Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a lecture inside the exposition's meeting halls. His argument that the American frontier was closed, that the era of expansion was over, and that American civilization was entering a new phase whose character remained undetermined, would become one of the most debated texts in American intellectual history. He delivered it to a half-empty room. Most of the fair's visitors were on the midway. George Pullman, whose model company town sat just south of Chicago, was already preparing to cut worker wages while maintaining the rent levels in his planned community. The decision that would trigger the Pullman strike of 1894, one of the most violent labor confrontations in American history, suppressed by federal troops and led by a railroad union organizer named Eugene Debs. For 6 months, 27 million Americans walked through a city that worked the way no city they actually lived in worked: clean, integrated, lit, coordinated. Then it was gone, and the conversation it had started was never finished. What followed the fair is, in the official narrative, a straightforward story of influence and inspiration. The City Beautiful movement was born from the White City's aesthetic. Within 8 years of the fair's close, 17 major American cities had initiated planning commissions that explicitly cited the 1893 exposition as their founding model. Daniel Burnham moved directly from directing the fair to shaping the future of American urban planning. The Macmillan Commission of 1901, which redesigned the National Mall in Washington, D.C., drew on the White City's spatial logic. Charles McKim, one of the fair's principal architects, led the commission with Burnham's direct involvement. Burnham's 1909 Plan of Chicago, the most influential urban planning document produced in America, a work that shaped how dozens of cities imagined their physical futures, opened with explicit homage to the White City and to the principles demonstrated there. The image survived. The logic did not. Not one of the 17 city planning commissions attempted to replicate the fair's integrated infrastructure model. Not one proposed a publicly owned electrical utility system built on the alternating current principles demonstrated at the exposition. Not one proposed an underground service network connecting civic buildings. Not one suggested that a city could be designed as a unified system owned in common by its inhabitants. The boulevards traveled forward. The civic plazas traveled forward. The neoclassical facades traveled forward. The tunnels, the electrical logic, the integrated engineering, the ownership model, these were quietly left behind, never formally rejected, simply absent from every document that claimed the White City as its inspiration. The question of why requires a different archive than the architectural one. General Electric was incorporated in 1892, 1 year before the fair opened its gates. J.P. Morgan, who had spent the latter half of the 1,880 seconds consolidating Thomas Edison's various electrical enterprises, was its primary financial architect. Charles Coffin became the company's first chief executive. GE was, from its formation, built around centralized, standardized, direct current infrastructure. The fair's AC triumph did not destroy this structure. It accelerated a reckoning that Morgan was already prepared for. Within 36 months of the fair's close, Morgan had engineered a series of financial consolidations that gave General Electric dominant control over the American electrical market, not by winning the technical argument, which Westinghouse and Tesla had already won publicly in front of 27 million witnesses, but by acquiring the patents, the distribution networks, the manufacturing capacity, and the capital relationships that determined who could build electrical infrastructure at scale in the United States. The lights went out at the fair in October 1893. Within 3 years, the company that had lost the lighting contract effectively owned the future of American electricity. The fair's closing day carried a detail that history has folded into the background noise of the period. On the 28th of October 1893, as the White City held its closing ceremonies, Carter Harrison Sr., the mayor of Chicago, the politician who had championed the exposition from its earliest planning stages, who had publicly imagined what the fair's demonstration might mean for American cities, was shot and killed at his home by a disappointed office seeker named Patrick Prendergast. The investigation was rapid. The perpetrator was identified and later executed, but the political vacuum that Harrison's death created arrived at precisely the moment when Chicago's city government needed to make decisions about the White City's future. 6 months later, the Pullman strike shut down national rail transit. Federal troops deployed under Grover Cleveland's executive order of July 1894 used the Jackson Park area as a staging and operations ground. The exposition site, so recently the most celebrated public space in American history, became a military logistics zone. And the demolition records from these months carry an anomaly that no subsequent investigation has resolved. Several of the White City's major structures were destroyed by fire before their scheduled demolition dates. The official explanation, recorded in the fire marshal's documentation, was arson committed by homeless individuals sheltering in the empty buildings. The fire marshal's records list 5 separate fires across 3 weeks. No arrests, no suspects named, no follow-up investigation appears in the public archive. At first, This reads as the predictable chaos of a large-scale decommissioning project in a city under social and economic stress. But the structures that burned were not the decorative ones. They were functional ones, and the fires come in a sequence that follows the demolition schedule rather than proceeding it randomly. The official explanation has never been seriously examined. Documented proposals existed, entered into city planning correspondence and early congressional discussion to convert the White City into a permanent public works complex, a national museum campus, a demonstration site for public housing, a permanent exposition ground. These proposals had advocates. They had preliminary institutional support. All of them died without reaching a formal vote. No official rejection of any of them appears in the public record. They were not defeated. They simply ceased to be discussed, as though the air that had sustained them was quietly removed. The men who had the power to advance these proposals, and who chose not to, were not indifferent bureaucrats. Lyman Gage, the fair's finance chairman, was a banker who had watched the White City's infrastructure model operate for 6 months and understood precisely what it represented as a challenge to privately owned utility networks. In 1897, Gage became U.S. Treasury Secretary under President William McKinley. The system demonstrated at the fair was not ignored by the men who ran the fair. It was studied. It was understood. And the decision not to replicate it was made by men whose names appear on the White City's own dedication plaques. The blueprint survived. The decision not to use it was made by the people who commissioned it. Burnham's 1909 Plan of Chicago makes this substitution visible if you know what to look for. The plan was not funded by the City of Chicago. It was funded by the Commercial Club, a private organization representing the city's business and financial elite. Jane Addams, whose Hull House had spent 15 years documenting what the absence of public infrastructure did to working-class neighborhoods on Chicago's Near West Side, was not consulted. The plan that resulted was beautiful in the literal sense. Boulevards, civic monuments, lakefront parks, unified street grids. It contained no proposal for public ownership of utilities, no integrated electrical infrastructure, no coordinated public housing system. The aesthetic inheritance of the White City was preserved with great care. The structural inheritance was surgically removed. The architectural press of the 1,890 seconds participated in this removal in ways that only become visible when you examine what it chose not to document. The World's Columbian Exposition was one of the most extensively photographed events in American history to that point. The official souvenir albums, produced in multiple editions between 1,893 and 1,895, and distributed in the hundreds of thousands, gave exhaustive visual attention to the Court of Honor, the neoclassical ensemble of the fair's central basin, its white plaster facades gleaming in the lake light, Sullivan's Transportation Building, the only structure at the exposition to receive an International Architecture Award, the Diplôme d'honneur from the Union Centrale des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, the only building on the grounds that rejected the neoclassical consensus appears as a marginal presence in these albums. A building that won the gold medal is the building that nearly disappeared from the photographs. Montgomery Schuyler, writing in the architectural record in the years immediately following the fair, was nearly alone among major critics in attempting to document the transportation building's significance. Sullivan himself did not publish his full account of what the White City represented until 1924 in the Autobiography of an Idea. He was in his late 60s by then, nearly forgotten by the profession he had shaped. 3 years from death. The book was not widely reviewed. Of the more than 200 major structures built for the exposition, exactly one survives intact today. The Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry, which stands in Jackson Park as the single physical remnant of what existed there. The rest were demolished, burned, or stripped from materials between 1894 and 1897. The Underground Service Tunnel Network. The engineering system that made the White City function as an integrated organism. The infrastructure that was the fair's most radical and most replicable innovation was filled in. No complete set of engineering drawings for the tunnel system is held in any publicly accessible archive. The one surviving structure is the building that had the least infrastructural function of any major exposition building. It was a container for aesthetic objects. It had no power generation role, no transit function, no utility integration. It was the building whose survival posed the least conceivable threat to any existing commercial interest. What survived was art. What was destroyed was the plumbing. But the technology itself did not disappear, and this is the third thing the official record of American electrification has never fully reconciled. In 1895, 2 years after the White City closed, the Niagara Falls Power Company installation was completed by Westinghouse and Tesla. It was a direct technical descendant of the Jackson Park system. The same alternating current principles, the same transformer architecture, the same generating logic that had lit 100,000 lamps on the shore of Lake Michigan. The Niagara installation transmitted electrical power to Buffalo, New York, 26 miles away, across open landscape, at a scale that made the White City's demonstration look modest by comparison. The technology worked. It had always worked. The White City's electrical system was not a prototype in the experimental sense. It was a proven system. It had operated continuously, reliably, and economically, in front of the largest peacetime gathering of human beings in American history. The reason no American city adopted the White City's integrated public utility model after 1893 was not technical. The technology was demonstrably viable. The reason was something else, and the something else left its traces in Morgan's consolidation records, in Gage's government appointments, in the commercial club's funding of Burnham's plan, in the committee silences where proposals for permanent infrastructure were quietly allowed to expire. The current that Tesla and Westinghouse demonstrated in Jackson Park in 1893 became the Niagara installation in 1895, became the Eastern Seaboard grid in the early 20th century, became the national electrical infrastructure that powers every building in America today. The wires survived. The ownership question, the question of who should control the infrastructure, who should profit from it, who should govern access to it, was answered in boardrooms, not in public forums. And the answer that was given has never been seriously revisited, in part because the moment when a different answer was publicly demonstrated has been so thoroughly removed from the national memory. The current flows. Who owns it? That's the part they buried. By the early 20th century, the White City had completed its transition from public memory to historical footnote, and the men who managed that transition were not passive. Charles Moore, Burnham's official biographer, published Daniel H. Burnham, architect, planner of cities, in 1921. It is the document that fixed the authorized narrative of the 1,893 fair for the next several generations of architects, planners, and historians. Moore's account emphasizes aesthetic vision, civic ambition, and the birth of the City Beautiful movement. His treatment of the fair's infrastructure, the tunnels, the centralized power system, the integrated utilities is minimal. His treatment of what the fair's model implied about public ownership of urban systems is non-existent. The biography did not suppress the White City. It curated it. And curation, done carefully, is its own form of erasure. Robert Moses, who spent 4 decades reshaping New York's public works infrastructure and who cited Burnham's planning philosophy with genuine admiration, absorbed this curated version of the White City's legacy as though it were the complete one. Moses built highways, parks, bridges, swimming pools, and housing projects. He understood urban infrastructure as a physical force. He cited the city beautiful tradition at every opportunity. He never cited the White City's integrated public utility model. He never asked why Burnham's plan contained no proposal for public ownership of electrical systems. By 1933, when Chicago hosted its second World's Fair, a century of progress held 40 years after the White City on the same lakefront. During the Great Depression, the institutional amnesia had fully hardened into institutional habit. The 1933 fair was privately financed. It was designed as a temporary installation. It was demolished immediately after closing. The fair's organizers had full access to the 1,893 records. They knew exactly what had been built in Jackson Park, how it had been built, at what cost, and for how many visitors. They made identical structural choices. The cycle repeated with the precision of a ritual whose original meaning has been forgotten but whose form is strictly observed. They built it again. They tore it down again. And again, no one asked why. The site of the White City Jackson Park, South Lakefront, Chicago, is currently under active development for the Obama Presidential Center. Environmental impact assessments conducted between 2018 and 2023 documented the surface and subsurface conditions of the park with considerable technical detail. The underground utility tunnels, if any physical trace of them survives beneath the fill material deposited over them in the 1,890 seconds, have never been formally excavated or mapped in any publicly accessible study. The Chicago Landmarks Commission's files on Jackson Park acknowledge the fair's historical significance. They do not address what may remain below the surface. The Museum of Science and Industry continues to operate in the one surviving building, drawing visitors who pass through the same neoclassical entrance that exposition visitors passed through in 1893, largely unaware that everything that once surrounded it was methodically removed. The argument that the White City was making about public infrastructure, about the ownership of electrical systems, about what a rationally planned city could provide for the people who lived inside, it is not a historical argument in the sense of being settled or resolved. It is the argument being made right now, in proceedings before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, in municipal broadband fights in cities from Chattanooga to San Francisco, in utility restructuring, debates that recur in every legislative session, in every state, with a significant electrical grid. The pattern is precise. The questions being asked in those hearings today are structurally identical to the questions that the White City answered, in physical and operational form, for 27.5 million witnesses in 1893. Historians have not explained why this parallel is unacknowledged in any major policy document. Urban planning curricula do not draw the connection. The regulatory debates proceed as though the question of public versus private infrastructure ownership is a new one, a product of the digital age, a problem without precedent. Eric Larson's 2003 book, The Devil in the White City, revived popular memory of the exposition for a new generation of readers. It is a work of genuine narrative skill, and it found an enormous audience. Its central subject is a serial killer who operated in Chicago during the fair, using the chaos and anonymity of the exposition's surroundings as cover for his crimes. The infrastructure of the White City, the tunnels, the electrical system, the integrated public utilities, the ownership model that was demonstrated and then methodically buried appears in the book as atmospheric backdrop, as texture and setting. The killer became the story. The city became the scenery. And that substitution, a monster in the foreground, a model in the background, is perhaps the most precise image of what happened to the White City's actual argument over the course of a century. It became the setting for a different story, a more manageable story, a story that did not require anyone to ask what happened to the plumbing. The white buildings are gone. The argument they were making is not. It is being made right now in city councils, in utility commission hearings, in zoning battles and broadband fights and infrastructure bills by people who have never heard of Jackson Park and who believe they are confronting a new problem. That is not a coincidence of history. That is the oldest kind of institutional victory. The kind where you erase not just the answer, but the memory that the question was ever publicly and successfully answered. The swamp that Burnham and Olmsted stood in 1890, is now a park. The park is being redeveloped. Somewhere beneath it, if the fill was not complete, if the tunnels were not perfectly erased, there may be passages that once carried electricity and steam and water through a city that lasted 6 months and suggested to everyone who walked through it that a different kind of city was possible. No one has looked. No institution has funded the excavation. No curriculum has assigned the question. The ground holds what it holds, and the silence above it is very old.